Refugees, these people are escaping. They're not choosing to move. And therefore, if you start putting quotas and limits, you are already managing it in a manner that limits the right of refugees to seek asylum where it is safest.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer. The world attention continues to be focused on President Trump's health, a story that has upended domestic and global politics. But today, I'm going to focus elsewhere on what has been an overlooked story. In a pandemic on the move, forcing refugees across the world to stand still. While nightmare scenarios of massive outbreaks in camps and settlements thankfully hasn't played out yet, coronavirus has taken a huge toll in other ways. I'm talking today to a man who has devoted his career to helping the world's most vulnerable, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi. 80 million people. It's a big number. It's 1% of the world's population. That's how many people are forcibly displaced right now, fleeing war, famine, and persecution from countries like Syria, South Sudan, and Myanmar. To picture the scope of this crisis, that's the populations of New York, Florida, and California combined, and the largest number of refugees globally since World War II. As their ranks have grown, so has resentment and anger about their presence in the countries where they've settled, putting some leaders on defense.
Wir haben gesagt, in einer Ausnahmesituation werden wir helfen, das haben wir getan.
We need to be bringing in people from around the world. We need immigration, and yes, part of that is accepting refugees.
While others have capitalized on anti-refugee rage for their own political gain at home.
You know, the problem is not a European problem. The problem is a German problem. Nobody would like to stay in Hungary.
When people do get here, Sam, it is very, very difficult then to send them away again, even though blatantly they've come here illegally.
The Democrat Party is openly inviting millions of illegal aliens to break our laws, violate our borders, and overwhelm our nation.
Some may be louder and prouder in their xenophobia, but the United Nations reports a global decrease in refugee resettlements in recent years, a steady drop since a peak in 2016. And 2020 has brought the most dramatic setback in mobility for refugees to date, as the pandemic shut down borders and dried up options for employment and education. Refugee camps are hardly known for their expansive resources or their top-notch medical care, so when coronavirus shot around the world, experts feared the worst. Huge outbreaks haven't yet hit most of these isolated communities, but a worsening economic situation is now a potential disaster. In Colombia, for example, tens of thousands of Venezuelan refugees have begun the journey back home to Venezuela, choosing the unrest and uncertainty that awaits over unemployment and hunger.
Que por favor nos abran eso, que lo queremos ir para Venezuela, Señor, que nos ayuden, Padre.
In the United States, President Trump has once again made immigrants a target on the campaign trail, specifically calling out refugees on the stump in Minnesota.
Biden will turn Minnesota into a refugee camp, and he said that. Overwhelming public resources, overcrowding schools, and inundating your hospitals.
Meanwhile, Facebook announced that they were removing a series of ads from the Trump campaign linking refugees to the spread of the pandemic.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
This comes as the United States has slashed its cap on the number of refugees they will accept in the coming year to 15,000. That's down from 110,000 in 2017, a number set in the final year of the Obama administration. That's just part of my discussion with Filippo Grandi, one of the world's foremost experts on refugees. Filippo Grandi, High Commissioner for Refugees at the United Nations. So good to be with you, sir.
Thank you. Same here.
So maybe start with some good news. You know, I was worried, and I think many of us were, many international organizations were at the early stages of this pandemic, that coronavirus was going to rip through refugee populations and it would be a humanitarian disaster. So far, haven't heard very much about that at all. Why do you think that is?
So there's a lot of pros and cons in this situation, but yes, the health impact has been less catastrophic than we thought. Refugees are all over the world. Refugees, displaced people, there's about 80 million of them. They're on all 5 continents, all situations. And I think that they have been impacted health-wise by the coronavirus, just like the populations they live with, usually their host populations. So you have many Venezuelans in Latin America really testing positive wherever testing exists and is available, but you have in other parts of the world less impact. And I have to say one thing which is difficult almost to explain. We've been campaigning very much in the last 5 years against ghettoizing refugees, against closed refugee camps, against places where they're confined. However, since many of those places still exist, it was easier to control the pandemic there for obvious reasons, but at a cost that is not sustainable, at the cost of everything, their livelihoods, their ability to move, and so forth.
I mean, we know how much political opposition there has been to the accepting of refugees well before coronavirus. Has this created significant additional changes, or were borders sufficiently closed to most refugees beforehand, especially in the advanced industrial economies, that frankly, the pandemic didn't have much additional impact on movement?
I would say three things. The health responses so far, we're not yet in the vaccine world, which will be completely different. But up to now, we have not seen discrimination, because I think every government, even the most reluctant to accept refugees, and there are many, is aware that if you exclude a whole group of people from treatment, prevention, etc., you put everybody at risk. So there was inclusion there. There was quite a rise in border closures, which, of course, to an extent we understood. Borders were closed for everybody, not just for refugees. So we made pleas, we work with governments to ensure that people fleeing for their lives, the most urgent cases, could still be admitted to asylum procedures. And this, we're slowly getting out of that, but we're worried that some governments will use the excuse to keep borders shut for refugees and asylum seekers. My main worry is the longer-term impact of the pandemic that we all know worldwide will be on the economies, on people's livelihoods. And refugees, displaced, stateless people are very vulnerable because most of them depend on the jobs that are the first ones to disappear in lockdowns. So that's where I'm worried, and I'm also worried that when these big rescue packages for the economies are put in place and implemented, then political considerations will prevail and maybe refugees will be excluded. Same for vaccine distribution, to ensure that we have almost some stockpiles ready for refugees, because exclusion becomes more political at that stage.
When you talk about vaccines and treatment, how are you going to break through an environment where most countries are really taking a more nationalist, a more my country first approach to this?
This is not new for us, unfortunately. Now, the pandemic has brought this problem to the fore for everybody. Unfortunately, in the sphere of refugees, asylum, migration, this my country first approach has started many years ago. Perhaps the first country who adopted it very strongly was Australia many years ago, and it has now become quite commonplace. I mean, certainly the US has also adopted some of those policies in respect of refugees, many European countries. This is something that we have, of course, tried to argue against, because at the same time, these are countries that lament that irregular movement of people is unmanageable. We argue back that managing that country by country will not manage it at all. May give the temporary illusion that it's closed because you build a wall or you push back at sea. The reality is that the phenomenon continues and you haven't resolved. Whilst working together, I know it sounds almost idealistic, but in fact, it's very pragmatic. Working together can produce the shared solutions that is the only way to address migration, refugees, but also the pandemic. So, there's a lot of parallelism, not to mention climate emergency and all that. All these are global issues that require global responses.
So, Filippo, you gave us the basic numbers, over 80 million refugees forcibly displaced. Those are the largest numbers of our lifetimes. And it seems that there's no reduction in sight. What are the principal drivers of that expansion right now?
Conflict, discrimination, persecution, I would add, in a language that was not used at the time of the convention, bad governance, are very important drivers. And the traditional one, the complication of the last, 10, 20 years is the combination of this with other factors that are less traditional, like economic factors, inequality, poverty, the demographic factor combined with poverty that makes richer countries more attractive, and the increased mobility that allows people to move on, sometimes using asylum channels, even if they're not really refugees. But everybody's moving because of some sort of vulnerability. And now, in the background of all that, or on top of all that, literally, or around all that, you have the climate emergency that is also likely to compel people to move. So unfortunately, I am not optimistic on numbers. I've been in this job for 5 years. We've seen every year an increase. We estimate that in the past 10 years, this number, the 80 million, has doubled.
The three largest economies in the world, the United States, China, and Japan, take virtually no refugees. What do you think those economies should actually be willing to accept? Not how much they're willing to pay, but how much they should be willing to accept in terms of this 80 million we're talking about.
Yeah, I think, Ian, it's not healthy or good or even possible to determine quotas in this way. Actually, many governments have proposed, let's go for quotas. This is risky. This is risky because you can apply quota to migration, to economic migration. You see what I mean? Economic migration is not a right. Economic migration is a different dynamic, legitimate, but different. There you can apply quota, like, Canada has a quota, I can't remember, 300,000 a year. Some European countries have a quota. Refugees, you have to accept that there is in refugee movements an irregularity that is part of the nature of the phenomenon. These people are escaping. They're not choosing to move. And therefore, if you start putting quotas and limits, you are already managing it in a manner that limits the right of refugees to seek asylum where it is safest. Now, of course, you have to avoid abuses. You have to avoid abuses of those that are not refugees at all, that are using asylum as a way to get into certain countries. That has to be addressed more quickly and efficiently than governments do. And you have to also avoid, what used to be called in the old days asylum shopping. I choose where to go depending on other factors. No, there has to be an element of you go where it's possible.
But for those that are trying to come to wealthier economies, for those for whom economic matters more, is the United States still as attractive a destination as it has been over the past decades?
I think so. I think it is. But the backlog of asylum claims in the U.S., it's astronomical. It's by far the biggest in the world because it's not an efficient system. But efficiency should not translate into pushing back people that have valid claims for asylum or before those claims are verified. And this is happening as well. And this is something that we have been discussing constructively, I would say, but in a way that worries us. And then there is another way to get, for refugees at least, to get in the US, and that's called resettlement. Resettlement is not refugees coming by themselves, is refugees being selected from other countries where they are hosted as refugees, say Lebanon, for example, or Kenya, and move to the United States according to certain criteria and after a very tight selection process. And now this administration has vastly reduced that number. The last administration had reached almost 100,000 per year, and we're now down to a few thousand. Now, this is not an obligation of any state to do that, but it is something that, states can offer to do voluntarily as part of this burden sharing that we were talking about. And this is a choice that any administration can make. We were not happy with that choice. We have discussed it many times with them, but for the time being, there's been no change.
We're talking about human beings, just like Americans, just like Europeans, who are being rejected, who are being treated inhumanely. And I wonder, 5 years in working on this job, devoting your life to it, and the situation is only getting worse, what makes you angry? What's the piece of this that is most, sort of internally unmanageable for you as a human being?
I have to tell you, I've worked with refugees all my professional life, for well over 3 decades. And we refugee workers, if I may say, are quite used to dealing with messy political situations. Refugees are not your standard, sweet, nice humanitarian issue. Refugees are always literally, physically, and figuratively on borderlines, in complicated situations. So we're used to dealing with nasty politics and with brutal situations. But what makes me upset is that we know that all over the industrialized world, the refugee issue has been manipulated for political reasons, because it has become popular to say, let's get rid of them, let's send them away, let's not rescue them at sea as here in Europe, let them die. I've seen horrible things being said because it's the refugees, it's the migrants that bring insecurity, distort our values, and steal our jobs. These are the 3 levers of fear that some politicians have used and abused. That makes me upset because it is not only profoundly wrong, morally and otherwise, but it is also completely inefficient. These are not the real issues. The real issue is we have a huge mobility that carries refugees and others, and we need to manage it well, seriously, with facts, statistics, strategies. None of this is done by those that are called here in Europe populists, that are using this purely to win the next election. This is what makes me really upset.
If we wanted to end on a positive note, when you look at the conflicts around the world, are there any that you think we are close to resolving so that refugees in large numbers around that issue would be able to return soon?
I have some hope, very, moderate hopes, because one, after 30 years, learns to be a little bit prudent in these matters, as you know very well. But I think perhaps in Sudan and in South Sudan, these are 2 countries that have generated millions of refugees and still living all over East Africa. And some of them actually, especially Sudanese, are part of those trying to cross into Europe. The last change in government in Sudan has now put in place a number of people, of leaders, of ministers that are all very determined to address this issue. And I hope that the South Sudan peace process, which is still quite shaky, will also produce the same situation. I've actually launched the idea with both governments that we sit together, even with regional states and institutions, and we look at strategies to resolve this big displacement. That would be fantastic, because it's millions of people that we would knock off from the 80 million. And it doesn't mean that everybody returns home. I hope many will, if peace prevails, but some may become residents wherever they are, and maybe at that point, Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, maybe even Japan, will take some as a gesture of burden sharing to show that these solutions are in the interest of the whole world.
Godspeed on that, and to you. Filippo, I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I know we all do. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks you very much.
Shortly after this interview, High Commissioner Grandi tested positive for COVID-19. He says his symptoms so far are mild. We wish him well. That's our show this week. Come back next week, and if you like what you see, and of course you do, because otherwise, why would we spend this quality time together? It makes my week. I know it makes yours. Take a minute to sign up for GZERO's most excellent morning newsletter. It's called Signal.